October 8th, 1985, marked the beginning of a string of brutal robberies that rocked South Florida. Two masked men used military weapons in a violent spree that threatened innocents. But no one knew who they were or where they would strike next. Before the FBI could stop them, lives would be lost, and law enforcement would be changed forever.
In Miami, a gang of robbers targeted banks and armored cars. They carried assault weapons and weren't afraid to use them. They struck during the day and sometimes twice a day. For a while, they seemed unstoppable. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. We knew that to stop these criminals would require stealth, ingenuity, and perhaps a little luck. No one expected to become one of the bloodiest chapters in FBI history.
Miami, Florida, 1985. To FBI agents, it seemed a city under siege. Each week, there were 3 to 5 bank robberies. Kidnappings, major drug deals, and shootings were everyday occurrences. But just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, a new breed of outlaws hit the streets and turned the Miami crime wave into a war. On October 8th, an armored car courier made a scheduled pickup at a steak and ale restaurant. The driver waited for his partner to return, unaware that 2 heavily armed men were also waiting nearby. As the guard approached the rear of the truck, the gunman advanced with military-style precision.
Hold it! Come out! I can't. Open the door! Tell him to open the door!
The driver refused to open his door. He drove away, following company policy. The subjects retreated to a getaway car and attempted to camouflage their escape with a military-issue smoke grenade. The Metro-Dade County Police and the FBI responded to the scene. Robberies of armored cars and banks fall under FBI jurisdiction. The supervisor of the Miami FBI's Violent Crimes Unit was Special Agent Gordon McNeil.
There were basically no clues as far as who these individuals were. We had absolutely no idea, no way to go. No one had seen them without the black hoods over their faces. They wore gloves on both hands.
One piece of information witnesses did provide was the license number of the getaway car. Agents tracked the number and learned the car had been stolen a month before. But the lead was a dead end. The robbers had escaped with only $2,800. But their use of military weapons and commando tactics convinced Agent McNeil they would probably strike somewhere in Miami again. But where and when? The answer came just 8 days later. At a busy supermarket on South Dixie Highway, another armored car arrived to make a scheduled pickup. A courier returned to the truck with several money bags filled with cash and receipts. He never saw the car that came around the corner. escaped empty-handed. Metro-Dade police and the FBI quickly responded to the alarm.
6 Adam 31, 1097.
These men were clearly not afraid to use deadly force. The courier would later die from his injury. While he was taken to the hospital, agents interviewed his partner. As he described the gunmen, it quickly became obvious they were probably the same men responsible for the previous robbery at the Steak and Ale restaurant.
There was no money taken in that particular robbery, but there were a number of shots fired. So the ante was still going up here as far as I was concerned because of the continued use of violence by these two individuals.
Ballistics evidence would further confirm the connection between the two robberies. Investigators found double-aught buckshot from a 12-gauge shotgun, 45 caliber bullet casings, and 223 shell casings. The 223s seemed most significant.
And the identification division of the firearms unit of the FBI laboratory compared those two shell casings and said they were fired from the same weapon. So we definitely had a link now between the Winn-Dixie attempt and the Steak and Ale robbery.
Two violent robberies were linked to the same masked gunman, but there were no leads to their identities. Because they had not scored any cash at the Winn-Dixie robbery and so little at the Steak and Ale, investigators were certain they would soon strike again. 2 weeks later, on Friday, November 8th, a third robbery occurred. This time a bank job at the Florida National Bank. As a teller and a guard walked from the main building to the drive-thru, two masked gunmen emerged from a car. At gunpoint, they ordered the teller to open the door to the drive-thru.
Get it open now!
She tried to comply, but there was a problem with the key.
Hurry up!
Stalled in broad daylight at a busy intersection, the gunman aborted the robbery and fled with only the $10,000 the guard had been carrying. Within minutes, local authorities and the FBI Violent Crimes Unit responded to the scene of the crime. Just a few blocks away from the two previous robberies.
This pattern was starting to develop that all these crimes were happening in the same general area along U.S. Highway number 1.
FBI interviews with the bank employees confirmed that the robbers were the same pair who'd hit the armored cars. Maybe they figured a drive-through bank would be less heavily fortified than armored cars, easier sources of cash.
There was no higher priority in this case. We had to find these guys, and we had to get them off the street before they killed more innocent people.
But just an hour and a half later, they hit the Professional Savings Bank only 18 blocks away.
Get your hands up! Get your hands up! Get on over there! Get out of the ground! On the ground now! Get out now! Get out! Get out! You, come here! Come on over here! Come on! You, come over here!
The robbers
Come on
quickly
now.
took control of the lobby. At gunpoint,
Put your hands
both
down.
customers and employees quickly followed their orders. With their masks and high-powered weapons, no one doubted they meant business.
Face down! Face down!
This time, they scored big.
Stand!
They raced off with over $41,000, delivered earlier that day by Wells Fargo. They escaped in yet another getaway car, a Chevy Monte Carlo. Witnesses had little to tell agents. The robbers had entered quickly and forced everyone down on the floor where they couldn't see what was going on.
Say to you exactly.
Get your hands up.
But since the men had actually been inside the bank this time, perhaps the security cameras had captured them on tape. Agents were soon disappointed to learn that the cameras had somehow malfunctioned and nothing had been recorded. It was the fourth robbery in 6 weeks. The heavily armed robbers were looting banks and armored cars in broad daylight.
The witnesses in these cases indicated that they felt that these people looked like true professionals. The way they walked, the way they talked, the way they carried the weapons. And I truly believed up until when we finally found out who they were, that we could very easily have been dealing with police officers here or very recent ex-military.
With such violent criminals on the loose, agents honed their own skills on the firing range. They worked the case relentlessly, exchanging whatever slim leads they had. But nothing panned out. 2 months went by without another robbery, and still there were no leads. On Friday, January 10th, 1986, William Roberts prepared to make a transaction at the Barnett Bank, just as an armored truck was unloading outside. He looked up from his checkbook and watched as 2 masked robbers shot the guard in the back. As the guard lay on the ground, one of the gunmen shot him twice more. This was the robbers' 5th heist in just 3 months, and another big hit. They fled with $54,000. William Roberts trailed the men for blocks. Though he maintained a safe distance, Roberts worried the thieves knew he was following them. Still, he stayed on their tail and noted their license tag and car model. He tracked them to a parking lot where they pulled in next to a white pickup truck. Roberts parked across the street and continued to watch them. He noted the make and model of the pickup truck, but could not see the tag number. After driving off, Roberts would flag down an officer and tell him the story. The FBI responded to the scene and interviewed bank employees. They found several .223 rounds, later determined to be fired from the same weapon used in the first 2 robberies. Nearby FBI agents examined the getaway car the robbers had left behind. But William Roberts was the star witness. Thanks to Roberts, the FBI had the first big break in a 3-month string of violent robberies. A check on the license tag of the getaway car revealed the car was registered to a man named Aureliano Brielle. Agents prepared to pay him a visit. Since the car had never been reported stolen, they suspected Brielle was involved in the crimes. They dressed for safety. In Miami, the FBI had been tracking 2 masked gunmen who had been robbing armored cars and banks, already killing 1 guard. Now agents had located the registered owner of one of the getaway cars. On January 14th, Special Agent Morellis and a partner arrived at the home of Aureliano Brielle, the registered owner of the car. A woman opened the door. Special Agent Morellis now works undercover and wears a hood to protect his identity.
She asked me if I was there about her son, and I said yes, I was, as a matter of fact. She said, well, my son Emilio has been missing.
Mrs. Brielle's husband came to the door and they invited the agents to come into the house. Mr. Brielle explained that his son Emilio had disappeared 3 months ago with the family car, which he borrowed to go target shooting in the Everglades. The Brielles had filed a missing persons report, but heard nothing. They had hoped the agents brought news of their son. But both the Brielles and the agents would be disappointed. The FBI knew nothing of the young man's whereabouts. And as the interview progressed, Agent Morellis grew certain the Brielles knew nothing of the robberies.
The conclusion at the end of the day was that the Brielle family was not involved. They were victims. Their car had been stolen and their son was missing.
The Metro-Dade Police Department processed the Brielle's car with FBI agents observing. But evidence technicians found no fingerprints or anything else to advance the case. The next 2 months were quiet again, though the robbers remained on the loose. Agents worked other cases as they continued to mine every possible resource for clues. Then on March 14th, Special Agent Ben Grogan told a skeptical Agent Morellis about a newspaper article he believed was related to the case.
Show up in the next heist. I guarantee it. That car right
The
there.
article reported the attempted murder of a man named Jose Collazo 2 days earlier.
Watch.
2 men had shot Collazo multiple times. Then they had stolen his gun and his car, a black 1982 Chevy Monte Carlo.
Guarantee you I'm right.
Grogan swore that the vehicle would be the bank robber's next getaway car. While it seemed to some agents nothing more than a hunch, they respected Grogan.
Car and disappeared. Shot him 4 times with the arm, through the face.
At 53, he was a career agent with 25 years on the job, including time as a SWAT team leader.
Is he still alive? Yeah, he got up, walked 1.5 miles to a convenience store, made a phone
His colleagues called him the doctor because he could do jobs no one else could do.
What do you think? Check on these plates.
So they took a chance on his hunch.
Get on it. Good job.
Mr. Collazo, tell me what happened. These 2 guys.
Grogan and another agent visited Collazo in the hospital.
They were 2 white males. 2 white males.
Collazo was in rough shape, with wounds to the side of his head, his arm, and his back. But he managed to tell the story of his nightmarish afternoon in the Everglades.
Oh my God, there's a car and...
Collazo had gone to a recreational trail near a lake, where gun owners often practice target shooting. He was firing his .22 when 2 men drove up beside him.
How you doing?
The driver pulled a gun on Collazo,
Hold up. Shut up.
who somehow had the presence of mind to identify it as a steel blue Magnum revolver.
Shut up.
He pegged the other man's rifle as a Ruger Mini 14.
Shut up. Shut up. Give him the gun. Give him the gun.
When the assailants demanded Collazo's guns,
Now
car,
give him
and
your
wallet,
billfold.
he complied.
Now back on up. Back up. Give you everything. Back up. Shut up.
But they shot him several
Shut up.
times anyway,
Back
at
up.
close range. Then they left, taking Collazo's Monte Carlo and their own F-150 pickup truck. As they drove off, they believed Collazo was dead. He was just waiting until the shooters were gone. Then he would rally what little strength he had to survive.
Collazo had to make a decision as to whether he would try to live or just lay down and die. And Collazo said he chose to try to live. So he picked himself up out of that lake and walked almost a mile after being shot 3 times to seek help.
Finding Collazo was the best break in the case so far. He provided the single clue no witness until now could offer: a description of the suspects' faces. They had not worn masks when they assaulted him. Using Collazo's description, a Dade County police artist drew composite sketches of his assailants. The drawings would be made into posters with information about the suspects and their crimes, plus the warning that both men were heavily armed and extremely dangerous. Retired Special Agent John Hanlon, a 22-year FBI veteran then assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit, remembers what Collazo said.
Collazo was able to give a description of the guys. He told us about the white pickup truck. He was shot in the same general area as we thought Emilio Brielle had disappeared.
In the coming days, agents stepped up their efforts. They conducted a grid search of the streets crossing South Dixie Highway in the vicinity of the bank robberies.
I got the agents together. After I told them what I had on my mind, they looked at me like I was crazy. But I said, I want you to go down between 88th Street on South Dixie Highway and 185th Street and come up with any license numbers on white Ford F-150 pickup trucks. Something just told me in my gut that perhaps, who knows, we're trying to make our own luck. What is it, 1,000,000 to 1, 10,000,000 to 1? I don't know. But they came back with the license numbers of 10 white Ford F-150 pickup trucks.
Computerized checks of the license numbers would reveal the owners' names. Agents would then request driver's license photos from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Perhaps if Collazo saw the photos, he could identify the truck's owner. But in 1986, technology was slow, and before the photos came back from the DMV, the robbers struck again. On Wednesday, March 19th, just 1 week after Collazo's assault.
Get your hands up! Get your hands up! Turn around! Get out! Get out! Get down! On the floor! Both of them! Come on out! Get out!
The thieves hit another bank on South Dixie Highway.
Back up! Get out! Come on! Get out! Give me the bag!
It was their 6th hit in 5 months.
Give me the money! Put your face down! Be quiet!
One kept the terrified customers at bay. The other looted money from a teller.
Stand, everybody! Go, move! Don't look up!
The men escaped with over $8,000 in cash. As customers and employees recovered from the assault, an off-duty customs official who had seen the robbers flee called police. He'd noted the make of the getaway car, a black Chevy Monte Carlo, and the tag number, NTJ 891. Just as Agent Grogan had predicted, it was Jose Collazo's car.
They didn't even change the tag. And we're not really sure whether they were, well, we're pretty sure they weren't that stupid, but we speculate that in their minds, you know, they were these hard men. And we think that they were probably just saying, hey, in your face, police, you know, come and get us if you can.
Investigators learned little of value from witnesses. At this bank, the security cameras had filmed the entire robbery. But the videotape was of little use. The camera's lenses had captured little more than unidentifiable masked bandits. There was little doubt these robbers planned each hit carefully.
It appeared to me that they were doing surveillance of the banks prior to some of the robberies, because on most occasions they robbed the bank within 10 minutes of delivery of a cash shipment by an armored car company. So they were waiting until the cash was inside from the armored car company and then hit the bank.
On April 10th, Gordon McNeil and Ben Grogan discussed the case at firearms practice, sifting for any clues they may have overlooked. It had been about 3 weeks since the last robbery. There were no clues to the thieves' identities, but McNeil detected a pattern.
You're always looking in law enforcement for patterns of crime, things that seem to happen on a consistent basis. And the only thing that we had gone in these cases was this significant pattern that developed, always on Friday between 9 and 12, hitting the same banks multiple times, always in the same 40 square block area, always along South Dixie Highway.
Agents planned a surveillance for the next day. They would fan out to patrol the area where the robbers had struck so often.
Hey guys, you got a minute?
Yeah.
Unit Supervisor Gordon McNeil personally led the operation.
Everybody will leave from that location.
So we just couldn't wait for them to rob another bank. We had to get out there and we had to make our own luck, and maybe we could find them.
Start watching for the vehicle. If you come across
Agent Hanlon remembers what happened next.
put it into play, hopefully it'll work out.
Eddie Morales walked over and said, "Hey, let's go down there." And I thought, well, what the heck, you know? So as a whim, I mean, there was no pressure to go or anything of that kind. I mean, I certainly had enough to do, and I liked Eddie, and I figured, well, we'll go on down there, we'll ride down, and you know, rather cavalierly, and spend some good times with Ed, and we'll take it from there.
Many believed it was a long shot, but 14 Miami FBI agents met in a parking lot at 8:45 a.m. on Friday, April 11th, 1986. They would surveil a 53-block grid along South Dixie Highway, where 2 commando-style gunmen had pulled off 3 bank robberies and 3 armored car heists in 6 months. The suspects were described as white men of medium build, one with a handlebar mustache, both about 30 years old. They were heavily armed and extremely dangerous. They might be driving a black Monte Carlo, license number NTJ 891. After a robbery spree that had lasted 6 months, Miami FBI agents went on the offensive in search of 2 killers, possibly driving a black Monte Carlo. They met to patrol an area where the 2 armed robbers had used military tactics to hit armored cars and banks. All would be stationed along the major thoroughfare of South Dixie Highway. Agents Ben Grogan and Jerry Dove were on their way to stake out the Barnett Bank when the impossible happened. A car that fit the description of the suspect's vehicle pulled directly in front of them. In disbelief, Agent Grogan advised all units of what he saw.
Attention all units, we're behind.
Gordon McNeil remembers the call.
Grogan was not an emotional person. Nothing could get Grogan excited. And I still remember his voice. He said, "We are behind a black Chevrolet Monte Carlo, Dade, Florida tag, NTJ 891. He said, "That's the tag, isn't it, Gordo?" I mean, he was just incredulous.
Agents Morales and Hanlon were stationed at the Professional Savings Bank when they heard Grogan's call. They began to search for their colleagues. Hanlon was driving, with Morellis working the radio. Hanlon tried to get a gauge on Grogan and Dove's location.
And I remember saying to Eddie, call Ben, tell him to start calling the cross streets so we'll know how close we're getting. Before Eddie had a chance to go on the air, Ben starts calling off the cross streets, and we're hitting those cross streets, one after another, so we were real close to them.
After proceeding south for several blocks, Hanlon and Morellis closed in behind them. The robbers soon suspected they were being followed. Whether they knew their pursuers were FBI or not, the suspects wanted to lose them. They took a right turn on 117th Street into a residential neighborhood, quiet at this time of day.
You're still following?
Still behind us.
They're coming.
They turned right again, trying to lose the tail. But the agents hung on, playing for time, as Agent Morellis recalls.
We were just trying to wait for as many FBI units to get to the location as possible. And we were also basically responding to what the subjects did. They weren't in any hurry. When they turned onto 120th Street, they actually slowed down.
The caravan continued on, with the agents always concerned about endangering innocent bystanders. Then the suspects made a left onto 82nd. It appeared they were heading back to the busy highway, where civilians would be at risk should a confrontation turn violent. When Grogan saw the silhouette of a long-barreled rifle through the rear window of the subject's vehicle, he knew it was time to act.
Shut any car stop, let's do it.
It was clear the suspects were preparing to do battle. Grogan put the light on his car and ordered a felony stop. Grogan pulled alongside the suspect's car and ordered them to stop. The suspects ignored the order, and Grogan pulled ahead of them, blocking their escape. Hanlon and Morellis moved up, boxing them in. The sight made an indelible impression on veteran agent John Hanlon.
And I'll never forget the man's face. I could pick him out today. He looked like your basic Western bad man. He looked very, very determined.
It seemed the suspects were as desperate to prevail as the agents who pursued them. Two heavily armed fugitives had ignored FBI orders to stop their vehicle. Special agents now tried to force them to comply. The last to catch up to the group was Agent Richard Manauzi. As he pulled behind the suspect's car, he saw one of the gunmen take aim at Morellis and Hanlon. Manauzi rammed the fugitive's car from behind.
They swung into a U-turn, and then Manauzi was able to hit him again and knocked him over into this parking area up against some cars over there.
passenger opened fire with a Mini-14 assault rifle. Outgunned, Agent Manalzi crawled to cover. Agent McNeil arrived seconds later, firing at point-blank range. They were surrounded by FBI. Their vehicle could not move, but they had superior firepower. And they refused to surrender. The driver fired a shotgun blast at Grogan. McNeil hit the driver in the neck. But the semi-automatic kept pumping out the rounds until one finally caught McNeil in the hand. Morales and Hanlon advanced to cover him. Hanlon's .38 held 5 rounds. The Mini-14 had 30 rounds in each clip. And one of them shot down Agent Morales.
It was all one continuous recollection. It was like 1 second I'm looking at Gordon McNeil's back, trying to maneuver to his left, and the next second is blue sky. And I looked at my left arm, and my left arm was completely shattered. It was like roadkill.
His partner was down, but the shooter kept on firing. But when he tried to escape out the window, Jerry Dove hit him in the chest with his 9mm. But to Dove's horror, the man shot McNeil in the neck.
I couldn't move my upper body, I couldn't move my arm, and I couldn't move my legs. So I assumed that I was totally paralyzed at that particular point. I couldn't move.
2 more FBI agents arrived and joined the gunfight. By now, the shooter had been hit 4 times, but he continued to advance and fire.
He just made up his mind that he was gone down, he was gone out, and he was going to take as many of us with him as he possibly could.
The agents knew they were outgunned, firing 6 shooters against the suspect's 30-round semi-automatic assault weapons. Dove and Grogan were forced to retreat behind their car to reload. Hanlon, too, reloaded. But the shooter kept on coming.
One went right through my knuckles on my right hand and through the knuckle in my thumb. A bunch of lead and whatever went into the back of my arm, and I remember my gun flying. I said, "Ben, I've been hit."
As Hanlon tried to retreat under the bumper, the gunman shot him in the groin.
The blood geysered from my groin to my knee. I mean, the blood just came out like a balloon breaking.
Grogan was hit. And then Dove. Before they could reload their weapons.
I remember Ben saying, "Oh my God," and he fell at my feet. And at some point along in here, I heard the breath go out of him. He went, "Ah."
The subject made his way to Agent Dove's car. With his left arm nearly blown off, Agent Morales managed to pull himself out. The shooter was trying to flee, and Morales had to stop him. Mortally wounded, the second suspect somehow dragged himself out of his car and joined his partner. If the car started, Morales knew they could only go in reverse and back over the fallen agents.
Eventually, I just got angry because I knew internally that I was dying, and my one last thought was, hey, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna take these guys with me. I'm gonna make sure that they're dead.
With his shotgun empty, Morales changed to his revolver and staggered forward, firing at the subjects. Morales' shots lodged in the men's spines, killing them both. It was a violent end to the lives of two violent men. Just a few minutes after it began, the bloodiest firefight in FBI history ended in tragedy. 2 agents were dead and 5 wounded. 2 suspects, still unidentified, had also been killed.
Over here! Hurry up! Hey, let's have a killing me, man!
314. Agent Jerry Dove lay dead. At the age of 30, he'd earned a law degree and fulfilled his boyhood dream of joining the FBI. He wanted to make a difference and had given his life trying. His partner, Ben Grogan, had also perished in the firefight. He had been just 1 year away from retirement when his wife could finally have stopped worrying about her husband's dangerous career. Crime scene technicians arrived at the site. Metro-Dade County Homicide Bureau Sergeant David Rivers was also there. Rivers had the Herculean task of reconstructing 5 minutes of living terror. That would take weeks.
Well, we have to find out what happened. And you do that in various ways. You obviously speak to the agents that were involved, and they can tell you what each one of them did individually. And then part of that is to take those different statements as to what they did individually and match it up with the physical evidence. The wounds on the body, the bullet holes in the cars, where the guns are located, where the cars are located, and to reconstruct it to make sure everything's exactly interpreted properly.
Technicians recovered 143 bullets fired from the fugitives' weapons. Questions that had plagued agents for so long were finally being answered. The Ruger Mini 14 rifle used to kill agents Grogan and Dove would match the .223 bullets found at some of the armored car and bank robbery scenes. In fact, the FBI crime lab could now forensically link the killers with several of the earlier heists. And from fingerprints, the agents soon identified the subjects as 32-year-old Michael Lee Platt and 34-year-old William Russell Maddox. But one question remained. What kind of men had wreaked this destruction, and why? Agents could not have been more surprised by what they learned from the killer's friends and neighbors. Instead of outlaws living on the edge, prepared for the ultimate confrontation, Platt and Maddox were known as quiet family men. Photos showed their families relaxing together. Platt had a wife and 3 children. Maddox was a single dad. They were partners in a landscaping business. But further investigation gave up the lie of their double life. Inside a shed, agents found guns and ammunition, including the .22 Maddox and Platt had stolen from Jose Collazo when they tried to kill him in the Everglades. Agents would also uncover evidence of a bizarre murder pact in which the men may have killed each other's previous wives. No one had been charged in the two cases, but now they would be reopened. Within days, agents would confirm that Maddox and Platt had killed 25-year-old Emilio Brielle in the Everglades. A hiker found Brielle's skeletal remains in the Everglades, not far from where Collazo had been assaulted. Then another tragic footnote surfaced.
Hey, how did that interview go for you earlier today?
Special Agent Steve Warner received a package from the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles. In it was a copy of William Russell Maddox's driver's license. He was the owner of one of the white Ford F-150 pickup trucks agents had located a few weeks before. But there had been a delay in sending the licenses.
If they had arrived April 11th or prior to that, Collazo would have been able to positively identify Maddox, and we probably would have been able to arrest Maddox, and also Platt, and 2 FBI agents wouldn't have been killed. But that's not the way the luck worked out in this particular case.
The FBI investigation revealed that both of the killers had served in the military. Platt had been a ranger, a member of the Army's elite First Strike Force, which explained the pair's commando tactics, fundamentally different than training received by law enforcement.
We don't have an acceptable body count in civilian law enforcement. We're taught one way, and that's defensive type shooting. You take cover, you do not take casualties. And then you look at the way Platt reacted that day. He reacted in a military fashion. He had the heavier weapon. He had the Mini 14 with a 30-round capacity. His back was basically against the wall. He had no place to go, so he advanced forward on our position, laying down suppression fire, and ambushed Grogan and Dove, who were behind the car.
As agents finally put the pieces together, a frightening portrait emerged of two formidable adversaries.
At the end of the shooting, Platt had 11 hits, Maddox had 6 hits. Platt was literally shot to pieces, and he kept fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting until he ran out of breath. He fought to the last.
They were going to die, it's just they weren't dying fast enough. And they weren't prepared to lay down and die. Yeah. They weren't about to give up.
Out of this tragedy came some positive changes that have improved the safety of all in the law enforcement community. Agents and officers now carry more powerful weapons, and their training better prepares them for violent confrontations like the one on April 11, 1986. As hundreds mourn the deaths of 2 dedicated and selfless FBI agents, those in law enforcement have looked for meaning in the tragic events of that April morning. Over the years, Gordon McNeil has found some resolution.
The story's not Platt and Maddox. It's not important who they were. It's important to recall the courage that was shown by the agents that day and the FBI. They did their job.
In Miami, a young man is abducted at gunpoint. The kidnappers demand a fortune and threaten to kill. The police and FBI uncover disturbing leads and look for answers in the smallest clues in a desperate race to find the victim and bring him home to his family.
kidnapping can shatter a family, bringing terror and heartache without warning. In 1984, with the flash of a gun, an ordinary business transaction became a violent abduction. In seconds, the son of a wealthy Miami developer was gone. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The kidnapper's motivations seemed to be money, but agents would learn this case and its resolution were more complicated than anyone believed.
Miami, Florida, Tuesday, August 7th, 1984. At 6 o'clock, the sales office of real estate developer Jesus Portela was closing. Mr. Portela had emigrated from Cuba 22 years earlier, building a successful business in Miami. His 22-year-old son, Mario, was recently married and worked as a salesman for his father, as did Mario's uncle. A little after 6, a couple approached the office. Mario and his uncle went out to talk with him. The couple asked about condo prices. The man seemed anxious as they spoke. The uncle explained that the office had closed. He asked them to return in the morning. At the couple's request, he went inside to get some brochures for them. He didn't see what was happening outside. An armed man had pulled up, and the three were abducting Mario. The uncle spotted temporary tags on the car, but only got the last 3 numbers. He told Jesus what he saw. Mario, forced into a blue and gray car, heading north on 122nd Avenue. Then he called the police. But Mario's father couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He went looking for his son. Soon he spotted a car matching the description of the kidnapper's vehicle. For years, he had carried a licensed gun for protection. Now, he was ready to use it. But it was the wrong car. Realizing he couldn't find the kidnappers himself, Jesus returned to wait for the authorities. The Metro-Dade police responded to the kidnapping call. For Detective Alvaro Romero, abductions were not unusual in 1984.
At that time, we were inundated with kidnappings. We had probably 1 kidnapping a month related to narcotics or drug-related kidnappings, where the victims would either be involved in drugs themselves or possibly family members were involved in drug dealings.
But detectives quickly realized Mario's abduction was different.
Questioning Mr. Portela and recognizing the fact that he was a prominent businessman in the community led us to believe that it was not narcotics related and strictly a financial gain for the people who kidnapped his son.
It meant anybody who knew of Mr. Portela's wealth could be a suspect. Hoping the kidnappers left some trace behind, crime scene technicians dusted the door for fingerprints. Mario's uncle believed they might have touched it as they peered inside. No usable prints were found. Less than an hour after the kidnapping, the phone rang.
Hello? See?
Speaking in Spanish, the caller asked for Mario. Mr. Portela didn't recognize the voice.
No. ¿Quién habla?
The caller then announced he was part of a terrorist group that was holding Mario for $3 million in ransom. Although no recording equipment was in place, a Spanish-speaking detective listening in identified the caller's accent as Colombian. The caller threatened to kill Mario if Jesus notified police or the FBI, and warned that the group was watching the Portela house and gave the address. The distraught father pleaded to speak with his son.
Hello?
The kidnapper announced he would call Jesus' home in 3 days.
Hello?
Police could not trace the call, but it helped them understand the type of criminal they were facing.
We felt the kidnappers were very violent. They took precautions as far as the phone calls that they were making, and they were very serious in their threats. They knew what they were doing, and we took them very seriously.
As with any kidnap for ransom, Metro-Dade police called the Miami field office of the FBI for assistance, and the case went to Special Agent John Gill.
The FBI was involved from the very onset. The very fact that a large ransom was demanded caused it to fall into the jurisdiction of what we call the Hobbs Act.
The Hobbs Act makes extortion affecting interstate commerce a federal crime, and Mr. Portela's business reached across state lines. Agents from the FBI's reactive squad installed recording equipment on Mr. Portela's office and home phones and arranged to have all incoming calls traced. The next day, Special Agent Gill wanted to talk with Jesus Portela, but not at the trailer or at home. He asked Jesus to meet him at an empty garage. Agents watched the entrances and exits of the garage for any sign of the kidnappers, but did not see anyone. As far as they could tell, it was safe for Gill to question Mr. Portela.
Portela. Yes. My name is John Gill. Credentials, sir. I have been assigned the administrator of this kidnapping case.
The agent asked if Mr. Portela knew of anyone who had a grudge against him, or if he had ever been threatened. The worried father could think of only one minor incident. He said that 8 months earlier, a man and woman burst into his office. He knew the woman. Her name was Rose de Parias. She recently purchased a condominium from him and said she discovered her neighbor's payments were lower than hers. Mr. Portela explained that the difference was because the neighbor had obtained a better finance rate. It was between the buyer and the bank.
The payments were not made to him at all. The financier had paid for the condominium, and he was out of the picture, so to speak.
The two refused to accept the explanation. The man began threatening him, demanding that Portela refund the money. But there was nothing he could do. Before they left, Rose de Parias vowed she would get her money back, one way or another. Mr. Portela had reported the incident to police.
And the police talked to this particular woman and explained to her the circumstances of financing and interest payment, and she apologized, and Mr. Portela just assumed that this had all gone away.
Agents later tracked down Rose de Parias and learned she was living in another state during the kidnapping. When they confirmed her alibi, they ruled her out as a suspect. Investigators were getting worried. With each day that passes, the chances of finding a kidnapping victim alive drastically diminish. They hoped the kidnappers would call again.
And the victim, oh, we've got a victim.
If they did, the reactive squad was prepared, having wired Jesus Portella's home and office with telephone tap and trace equipment.
Meet at his office, right? All right, I'll be there.
Special Agent Gil Orantia and other investigators needed to be there to monitor the calls and run the equipment. But getting into the home unseen would be tricky.
The initial calls and our indications were that they were watching his home, they being the kidnappers. We were concerned that they might be able to detect that I was coming in.
They needed Mr. Portella's help.
I was crouched in the back seat as we drove to his home. We went into the garage and then we went into the house. We wanted to be able to record the phone calls and be able to capture everything that was said to him regarding any ransom demands.
Agents and Metro-Dade detectives would take shifts, staying with the Portella family 24 hours a day. They briefed Jesus on how to handle the calls. He would be the lead in the effort to get his son back.
One of the things early on, obviously, was to determine if he's even alive or not. And we discussed with Mr. Portella some of the things that he could ask the kidnappers, which only Mario Portella would know, proof of life questions, if you would, that could come back to us to verify, yes, we know he's alive.
In building a profile of Mario, with details about his life, including favorite foods and names of pets, the agents got to know the young man.
Mario Portella was the all-American kid. He had gone to school. He had maintained outstanding grades. He had just gotten married to a young lady, and they were newlyweds with a bright future. Everybody loved him. The reason that this case was so traumatic for so many people is that so many people could identify with them. They were the type of family that we all aspire to be, and they were living the American dream, but they ran into a nightmare.
As promised, the kidnappers called 3 days after the abduction. The caller ordered Mr. Portella to listen to a taped recording. The voice on the tape was Mario. He pleaded with his father to pay the ransom money, warning the kidnappers was serious and would kill him if he called the police or the FBI. Jesus told the caller he had discreetly begun the process of securing the money from his bank. Agents reminded Mr. Portella to ask the proof of life questions, including what Mario's nickname was as a child and the name of the dog his wife used to have. The man agreed to call back with the answers. Mr. Portella had kept him on the line long enough for agents to trace the call to a Miami payphone. But the caller had gone before surveillance units arrived. In the harrowing days after the kidnapping, Mr. Portella received several other calls. Speaking in Spanish, a different man talked vaguely and mysteriously of a business proposition apparently unrelated to the abduction.
The demeanor of Mr. Portella at the time was, I really don't have time to talk to you about business because I have other problems. This individual indicated on several calls that he, in fact, was a person that could help solve the problems. His persistence in trying to communicate his involvement in whatever Mr. Portella's problem was caused us to be highly suspicious that somehow he was playing a role or a part in the kidnapping or the ransom demands.
Jesus kept the man on the line, and investigators pinpointed the source of the call. It was coming from the same area as the kidnapper's earlier call. Surveillance units made it to the scene in time to spot the person on the phone. They followed him to a fast food restaurant, where he emerged with a takeout bag. From their biographical profile of Mario, investigators knew the restaurant's burgers were his favorite. They then followed the man to an apartment complex where his behavior was even more suspicious.
When he took the hamburgers to an apartment and delivered them through the door, having no conversation with the recipient, and this was the brand of hamburgers that Mario and his father fancied, yes, at that point we were suspicious that perhaps Mario was being held at that location.
The SWAT team responded and set up outside the apartment. The clock was ticking. They needed to find Mario. In Miami, the FBI and Metro-Dade police were trying to find Mario Portela and whoever kidnapped him. Their first good lead brought them to a Miami apartment where they believed the kidnappers might be holding Mario. The SWAT team quickly secured the apartment and searched each of its rooms. But Mario was not there. It had been a false lead for FBI Special Agent John Gill.
It was determined not only by search, but interview of the people there, that they were not related or associated with the kidnapping whatsoever.
Interviewing the caller, agents determined he knew nothing of the abduction and was merely trying to get work with Mr. Portela's company. Investigators again were forced to wait for the kidnappers to make the next move. It was the original caller. He answered the proof-of-life questions correctly, suggesting Mario might still be alive.
That's correct.
And again demanded $3 million. As instructed, Jesus tried to keep the caller on the line. He said he had spoken to the bank and could only come up with 1/3 of the amount. As Mr. Portela negotiated, agents traced the call to another Miami payphone. Units were on their way. Eventually, the caller agreed to $1 million. Trying to stall longer, Mr. Portela said it would take time to get the money since the bank was closed for the night. But the man ordered him to have it ready when he called back in 3 hours with instructions for the drop. Once again, he disappeared before authorities could arrive. Within the hour, Mr. Portela met plainclothes agents at his bank.
Looks like it's all here. You go ahead and sign for it.
There, the FBI recorded the serial numbers of the bills that made up the $1 million ransom, so they could be traced when the kidnappers spent them.
Good. Okay, John? Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
At the Portela home, agents hid a tracking device in the briefcase, hoping it would lead them to wherever Mario was being held.
Yes. Speaking.
The kidnappers called on schedule and gave Mr. Portela directions for the ransom drop. They ordered him to drive to a local restaurant, leave the car door unlocked with the money inside, wait for a call at a certain payphone, then go into the restaurant and sit down. The caller warned Jesus to go alone. With the loaded briefcases, Jesus began the trip. It took less than half an hour, but to the worried father, it must have seemed an eternity. The restaurant was in a tough and dangerous part of Miami. Undercover agents and Metro-Dade detectives were already there, watching. Agents also manned an empty apartment with a view of the restaurant. Jesus Portela arrived. carrying $1 million in cash and hoping finally to get his son back. But he would soon discover that nothing was as the kidnappers said it would be. Jesus Portela was on his way to deliver $1 million ransom in an unsafe part of Miami, hoping to get his son Mario back. The way he handled the troubling and dangerous situation impressed the investigators working with him, including FBI Special Agent Gil Orantia.
For him to have endured what he did, I have all the respect for him in the world. He performed very, very well. He did the things we asked him to. He did things that probably most of us couldn't do.
The FBI and Metro-Dade police had undercover personnel staking out the restaurant. But the place was closed, and Jesus began to wonder if it was a setup. He found a payphone, though not where the kidnappers said it would be. He was nervous about leaving his car unlocked with $1 million in it. He hoped the kidnappers would call before anything happened to him. If thieves made off with the money, he might never see his son again.
Waiting for a phone call, is that all right? Hopefully there's some clean cut to be around this area. Well, I'm waiting for a phone call. Don't you have something better to do? Keep going on.
Though he waited, the phone call never came. Eventually, Jesus had to leave with the ransom money, but without Mario. He and the investigators spent days waiting for the kidnappers to call again with new instructions.
There were no ransom calls that came after the drop failed. We were concerned at that point because obviously our only connection to them were the phone calls. That was our connection to the bad guys. That was our ability to do something about what they were doing. And when they stopped calling, we became very worried.
Although the kidnappers were not leaving new clues with ransom calls, older clues were beginning to pay off. FBI Special Agent John Hanlon was trying to find the car used in Mario's abduction. It was an older blue and gray four-door Chevrolet sedan and had temporary dealer tags, which were not in DMV databases at the time.
And of course, with a paper tag, it can't be traced, so the car looks perfectly legitimate and doesn't draw the attention of law enforcement.
Hanlon knew used car dealerships sometimes illegally rented cars that were for sale, placing temporary tags on them. He began phoning every dealership in the area. The time-consuming work paid off when Hanlon spoke to a clerk at one dealership in Miami.
I asked her, "You rent any old cars?" And she said, "Sure, and any old with paper tags?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Any old Chevys?" She said, "Yeah." I asked her, I said, "Any blue and gray ones?" She said, "Yeah." I says, "Where is it?" She says, "It's here." And I said, "Well, when was it rented?" And she says, August the 7th. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
August 7th was the day of the kidnapping. When agents discovered the car had been returned the next day, they impounded it to have it searched for evidence. Metro-Dade forensics technicians processed the vehicle. They found no usable hair, fiber, or fingerprint evidence. But they did find a keychain under the back seat. The FBI knew that Mario Portela drove a Volvo.
So we barreled back over there, picked up the keys. We showed them to the family members. Of course, they identified them. It also fit his automobile, and we took it by the house, and the house key fit his home.
It meant that vehicle was most likely used to abduct Mario Portela. Checking records, agents learned a woman named Julita de Parias had rented the car. The clerk at the dealership said the woman came in with a man she said was her brother. Hanlon requested driver's license photos of Julita de Parias and her siblings. 9 days after the abduction, Hanlon met with the clerk who had rented out the car, showing her a photo lineup that included a picture of Julita de Parias, along with several decoy pictures. The clerk identified Julita de Parias immediately.
Are you sure? Positive. Okay, let me ask you, would you look at it? Had you seen this individual before? I'd like you to take a look at it.
The clerk also identified the man who was with her. It was Julita's brother, Julio. Agents were familiar with the De Parias name. They remembered Rose De Parias was the woman who had had the dispute with Mr. Portela the previous year. Julita was Rose's sister. They now believed Julio De Parias was the man who accompanied Rose and threatened Jesus. Although the FBI still ruled out any involvement by Rose De Parias, her siblings were now prime suspects.
Once we had good suspects in this investigation, we put surveillance on some of the members in an attempt to gather more evidence.
The FBI noticed an unidentified man usually accompanied Julita. The couple seemed to be romantically involved. It had been 10 days since the abduction. Agents hoped the suspects would lead them to Mario Portela. They needed to question them, but doing so would alert any accomplices and put Mario's life at risk.
We couldn't exactly jump them at that moment because we were trying to rescue this young man. That was our primary objective, to get this young man back to his family. So we continued to watch them.
The FBI and Metro-Dade's surveillance effort included air and ground units. But the suspects seemed to be wary of a tail.
They were very erratic and paranoid in their behavior. Their driving would go in one direction and make a U-turn and go in another direction and then go through a parking lot and then in another direction, which was very taxing on our ability to surveil, in as much as you only have a limited number of automobiles to conduct a surveillance, and when you're passing by the same subject 3 and 4 times in the course of one trip, the chances of being identified as a surveilling vehicle are great.
The suspects' counter-surveillance techniques worked. Following them exhausted the helicopter's fuel supply, forcing agents to turn back. Ground units tried to remain undetected and keep the suspects in sight, but soon they lost them. It was a difficult blow to the investigation. 3 days later, and 25 miles north of Miami, in the town of Davie, Florida, 2 teenagers were walking in a field when they made a grim discovery that would provide terrible answers to a family hoping for the best. 13 days after Mario Portela was kidnapped, teenagers discovered a body in Davie, Florida, 25 miles north of Miami. Davie police realized it was a murder. The man's head was completely wrapped with duct tape. Detective Ed Taylor faced the challenge of identifying the victim.
All we knew at that time was it was a male. We didn't know how old he was because his entire head had been taped. His hands had been taped behind his back and his ankles had been taped together as well. So at the scene, we really didn't have very much information as to the identity of the victim or how old he was or anything of that nature.
They needed to examine the body, tape, and sleeping bag for more clues. and remove the evidence to the controlled environment of the lab. Dr. James Ongley, then Associate Medical Examiner for Broward County, performed the autopsy. He removed the duct tape surrounding the head, careful to preserve each tear and section for later analysis by forensics technicians. With the tape off, Dr. Ongley could describe the victim as male, between the ages of 20 and 40, 5 foot 9 inches tall, with brown eyes and brown hair. Although the victim had been severely beaten, the cause of death was asphyxiation. He believed the man had been dead for 24 to 36 hours. To aid in identification, Dr. Ongley photographed the victim for comparison with photos of missing persons. But he knew the pictures would not be accurate representations of the victim. The tightly wrapped duct tape had distorted facial features, and the summer heat caused significant decomposition.
We took fingerprints from the victim so we could submit them to other departments to see if he had ever been arrested before. We did a press release to the various newspapers with a description of the victim and ran a photograph of the victim to see if anyone could identify him.
On August 25th, a Miami newspaper ran an article about the body found in Davie. FBI Special Agent John Gill noted the description loosely matched that of Mario Portella and immediately contacted the Davie Police Department about the abducted man.
We had received prior dental records of Mario Portella from his family dentist, and those records were in evidence at the FBI office in the event that they were needed to identify a victim. Those records were brought to Davie, Florida. I met with Detective Taylor, and we both proceeded then to the Broward County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Ongley was then capable, with his experience, to take those dental films or x-rays and compare them to the body and positively identify that body as being our victim, Mario Portella.
For everyone trying to bring Mario home to his family, the news was devastating.
We had to notify the Portella family that the victim had been identified and deceased.
Now agents were investigating a murder. Reviewing the complex case, they outlined their suspects. Julio de Parias, the man who had threatened Jesus Portella the previous year. His sister Julita, whose name appeared on the rental contract for the abduction vehicle. And the man agents believed to be her boyfriend. All three had disappeared. Agents also developed another suspect, Hector de Parias, Julio and Julita's brother. He was close to his siblings and had a criminal record. Now, with no chance of finding Mario alive, the FBI's investigation could be overt. They interviewed the sister of three of the suspects, Rose de Parias, who had threatened Jesus Portella 8 months before the kidnapping. She denied any involvement and offered her full cooperation. She said Julita's boyfriend was Jesse Ramirez, and that if he and the others could not be found in Miami, they most likely went to Los Angeles, where they had friends. Miami agents forwarded the lead to the Los Angeles field office. There, Special Agent Gregory Pack knew they had no time to lose.
It was imperative to find these people as soon as possible because they are dangerous people, and they are people you don't want on the streets in your city or anybody else's city. If they did this once, kidnapped and murdered, what's to say that they wouldn't do it a second time to some other victim?
Special Agent Pack needed to narrow the scope of the search. He knew the suspects were of Colombian descent, and LA's Rampart district had a large Colombian population.
I went out there with these very good photographs, and I went to all the places that you and I would have to go to occasionally in a normal course of living. Dry cleaners, restaurants, hotels, motels, apartments. After a couple weeks of this door-to-door canvassing, I ran across the lady who was the apartment manager. I showed her the photographs.
She recognized Hector, Julita, and Julio de Parias as new tenants, but said they seemed to be rarely at home.
So I left my card with her and asked her if she would call me. And I called her at least once a day. This went on for probably 8 or 10 days. Finally, in the evening, about 9 o'clock, I received a call from the office, and this apartment manager was on the line and wanted to be patched through to me. So I accepted the call. And she told me that the people that I had been looking for were in the apartment now. We approached the apartment house, took up various positions so there wouldn't be any escape out the windows or other doors. And as we ran in the front door, there was a gentleman pointing a revolver at us. So we tackled him, wrestled the gun from him, took him into custody, and then there was another person there.
The man with the gun was Julita's boyfriend, Jesse Ramirez. He was held on charges of assaulting a federal officer. The other man in the room was Hector de Parias, Julita and Julio's brother. He was held on a parole violation for drug possession and burglary. 2 suspects were in custody, but 2 were still at large.
We knew Julita and Julio were still outstanding. So when we left, I had 2 agents remain at the apartment. Several hours later, Julita came back. She was taken into custody, and then she was brought down to FBI headquarters in Los Angeles.
Agents waited for Julio de Parias, but he never showed. The case agent in Miami, John Gill, learned of the arrests.
Gregory Pack, the special agent in the Los Angeles division, called our division here in Miami. I was immediately on an airplane the morning of the telephone call, met with Agent Pack at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles, where I briefed him on our experience and knowledge of the case.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias refused to talk to investigators. But Special Agent Gill and Davie, Florida Police Detective Ed Taylor had more success with Hector de Parias. They needed his help to find the 4th suspect, Julio de Parias. And they needed to know the details of Mario Portella's last days. On September 24th, 1984, the FBI apprehended 3 suspects in the kidnapping and murder of Mario Portella. But a 4th suspect, Julio de Parias, was still at large. Only one of the 3 in custody, Hector de Parias, agreed to talk. Still, he was evasive at first, and investigators caught him in several lies. Davie Police Detective Ed Taylor and FBI Special Agent John Gill decided on the soft approach to get the truth.
We befriended him in this style of interrogation, realizing that the potential was there to develop trust and cause him to, in a sense, confess.
So that we know
on the second day of interrogation, he became cooperative to the point that he was right on the edge of divulging his criminality.
Tell me, Hector.
As he became more trustful of Mr. Taylor and I, he advised us that, yes, he would cooperate and divulge details. He was not involved in the abduction, but several days after the abduction, Mario was being held captive in an apartment. The brother, sister, and the sister's paramour discovered that maintaining guard on a kidnapped victim is a lot of trouble, and they needed help. And they knew that Hector was available, that he was unemployed, that he was addicted to marijuana, could not get a job, and in fact would jump at an opportunity to participate in a venture with financial gain. So they solicited his help to watch a victim, as he put it.
According to Hector, the motive for the kidnapping was actually revenge. Julio de Parias felt humiliated that he could not force Mr. Portela to refund his sister's money after she purchased her condominium. Hector said that after several days, his brother Julio and Jesse Ramirez worried about getting caught and gave up on trying for a ransom. They decided they had to get rid of the only link to them, Mario Portela. So on August 17th, 1984, 10 days after the kidnapping, they decided to murder him. Jesse Ramirez began wrapping Mario Portela's head with duct tape as he pleaded for his life and prayed. As Mario struggled to breathe, Jesse beat him with a metal bar. After the murder, Julio de Parias paid Jesse Ramirez $1,000 for the job. Hector claimed to have no idea of Julio's whereabouts, but he did know where Mario was held and murdered.
Hector not only was able to give us an address of an apartment complex and the building unit, Hector was even able to draw us a diagram of the interior of the apartment, where the various rooms were, furniture, where the murder had taken place.
A team of agents, detectives, and forensics technicians rushed to the apartment in Miami. They secured it as a crime scene and processed it for clues. Any evidence recovered might help put Mario's killers behind bars. But seeing it brought back to investigators the disappointment of not being able to save the young man's life. Special Agent Gil Orantia was there.
As we entered this apartment, we saw a roll of duct tape on the side of a nightstand. We saw a bar that we believe was used to strike Mario with. We saw blood in the apartment. We saw all of these things that sort of put this thing, for us, evidentiary-wise, together. But it was a difficult thing to look at. It was a situation where, you know, our goal was to do the right thing and get him saved, and we couldn't do it. And it was tough. It was tough for us to look at that.
In addition to duct tape, investigators found pieces of adhesive medical tape in the room. They also recovered hair and fiber evidence. Everything was cataloged and sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. There, Special Agent Hal Dedman of the FBI's Trace Evidence Unit analyzed the items.
My involvement in the case dealt with the comparison of hairs, textile fibers, and tape from the 4 locations: the body recovery site, the apartment where the victim was held, a car that the body was transported in, and another apartment where clothing from one of the suspects was recovered.
He matched carpet fibers from those locations to samples found on the suspects and the victim. He also compared the tape wrapped around the victim's head, arms, and legs to the rolls of tape recovered at the murder scene.
If you have 2 pieces of tape that were once original or adjoining sections of the same piece of tape, and that tape is torn, the yarns are not all going to have the same appearance, they're not going to have the same length. You'll have short pieces and long pieces. And you can fit these pieces of tape together much like you'd fit pieces together in a jigsaw puzzle.
Special Agent Dedman determined the tear on the roll of tape from the apartment was a perfect fit with a piece of tape recovered from the victim's head. He also compared the tears on a strip of medical tape found on suspect Jesse Ramirez's shoes to those on the roll of medical tape found in the apartment and to those on a piece from the victim's body. It was another exact match.
Each piece of evidence contributed, and the result was that there was a tremendously strong association between the suspects in this case and the victim.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias were found guilty on kidnapping, extortion, and murder charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Hector de Parias pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 40 years. But the fourth suspect, Julio de Parias, was still out there.
We believed that he could have fled to Latin America somewhere. So we printed up wanted flyers that you'd find in your post office, in police departments. We sent them all over the place, and we developed the same ones in Spanish, and we distributed them throughout Latin America.
Almost 4 years after the kidnapping, in November of 1988, the FBI learned Costa Rican customs officials were holding a man who resembled the photo of Julio de Parias in the FBI's wanted poster. Special Agent Orantia flew to Costa Rica. The man did look like the photo, but it was his voice, the one from the ransom calls, that tipped Orantia off.
I had listened to those phone calls over and over and over again, hundreds of times. I knew that voice. That voice was a part of me as much as anything's a part of me. So at the moment he opened his mouth, that was it. That was it. It cinched it. I knew it was him.
The federal trial of Julio de Parias began 5 years to the day after Mario Portella's abduction. He was convicted of kidnapping, extortion, and murder, and sentenced to life. For the FBI agents who had gotten to know the victim's family, the convictions were important, but not the ending they had expected.
This was a horrendous crime. For some type of justice not to come out of it would have been difficult for the community in Miami and for the family, and I'll be honest with you, for us too, the agents. So I think the idea that some type of justice occurred is paramount. That's the only thing we can cling to, all of us, that at least they were caught.
The Portella family has persevered. They will never forget Mario, and they have not given up their dream. 3 mysterious deaths in a Florida river confound local authorities. The preliminary investigation reveals little. But when police and the FBI find a sinister link to international drug smuggling, they uncover a conspiracy of unbridled greed and ruthless violence. It's a case that thrusts an entire city into chaos.
In the 1980s, thousands of violent criminals flooded into America from Cuba and Colombia. Drugs hit South Florida, and the area, bloated with illicit wealth, became a violent powder keg. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. In the bloody Miami drug wars, the winners got rich, the losers buried, and everyone was a target.
Colombia, South America. Until the 1970s, life was simple but hard. Then, a failed economy gave way to a sharp rise in drug trafficking. The drug trade caused stiff competition that literally began to rip the country apart. Ruthless Colombian drug lords began consolidating their businesses into partnerships known as cartels. Death came to anyone who got in their way. As the cartel's influence grew, so did the American appetite for illicit drugs. And Miami became the prime point of entry for most of the cocaine smuggled into the country. And with it came bloodshed. Colombian assassins were sent to Miami to wipe out the local competition. The homicide rate grew to more than triple the national average for large cities. Miami was named the murder capital of the U.S. Former Metro-Dade homicide detective Alex Alvarez recalls how in 1979, violence came to a Miami shopping mall.
His date of birth is... Several drug traffickers bought out a step van, lined it with bulletproof vests and portholes, and did a drug hit in the parking lot and sprayed it with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds in the parking lot trying to kill their intended target.
2 known drug traffickers were killed, and several innocent bystanders were wounded.
There were also incidents of high-speed pursuits on the expressway between 2 drug dealers that were just shooting it out on the expressway during rush hour traffic. And numerous people were being injured and killed. It was like the wild, wild west, so there was a need to try to curb and stop these drug traffickers who seemed to be out of control.
A special squad was formed to deal with the violence. Central Tactical Unit, or CENTAC 26, was headquartered at the Metro-Dade Police Department. Sergeant George Placencia was a detective assigned to the unit, the first of its kind in Miami.
It was a 26th one in the nation. The purpose of forming that task force was that we would go out and monitor all the homicides in Dade County and pick and choose the ones that we thought involved major drug traffickers and attempt to work that angle, the homicide angle, and dismantle the organization.
By the mid-1980s, constant pressure from law enforcement slowly changed the way drug traffickers were doing business in Miami.
They got a little bit more sophisticated. They still did the murders, but not the shootouts in public.
Drug traffickers went deep underground, organizing cells that excluded all but family and close friends. Many cells specialized in activities such as cocaine transportation, distribution, or money laundering. In only a few years, the business had become large and sophisticated, and still very deadly. On the afternoon of July 29, 1985, a Marine salvager working on the Miami River noticed something. Off the bow of his boat, floating in the water, was a body. By the time Metro-Dade County Police responded, dock workers had pulled 2 more bodies from the river. The coroner examined the deceased for any signs of trauma or gunshot wounds. He found none. It appeared that the 3 had drowned. On the bodies, officers found beepers, Rolex watches, and plenty of cash. 2 were armed. Essentially, they were all carrying the tools of a drug smuggler. Metro-Dade police called CENTAC 26. Sergeant Placencia investigated.
Yeah, hold on, let me write this down. How many people you got over there? We started doing area cams to see if anybody had seen anything suspicious or had seen these individuals prior to them meeting their demise, and that proved to be, not so fruitful at all. Nobody had seen anything.
The 3 victims were identified as local Cuban Americans. 2 had minor police records. The official cause of death was drowning, but there was no indication how they ended up in the water or why. Detective Alex Alvarez searched for a lead in the case.
We began running records checks and contacting the Drug Enforcement Administration to see if these people were known drug traffickers.
Agents at the DEA did not know the men, but they did have a source that could help.
Right. What's the address? They had an informant, and that informant knew the son of one of the dead people that were fished out of the Miami rivers, and it was definitely drug-related. And he was going to put us into contact with the son.
That afternoon, investigators paid a visit to the son.
You know why we're here.
He was willing to tell what he knew, hoping that the mystery of his father's death could be solved.
Can you tell us what you know and how you found out about it?
Well, I know it's a really big business. He brings in thousands.
He told us that his father was one of the biggest drug smugglers in South Florida. He brought in thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of cocaine.
Well, I know last Saturday
He said his father's crew used run-down, steel-hulled vessels to smuggle drugs into the country, since the old boats aroused less suspicion than big yachts.
He had him called later
He
on.
also detailed how the smugglers built false bulkheads into the boats, concealing hidden compartments filled with hundreds and sometimes thousands of pounds of cocaine. When Customs searched these boats, their only hope of finding drugs would be to use a welding torch.
See, the smugglers are smart. They know that there's no way that Customs in the open ocean is going to put a torch to a boat, because if they're wrong, they'll sink the boat.
Now safely past Customs, the smugglers would continue to move their enormous cargo up the Miami River.
They would park at a marina and then let it sit there for 2 or 3 days to make sure there's no surveillance. And on the second, third, or fourth day, when they were convinced there was no surveillance, they'd come at the middle of the night, unload the drugs into vans, and ship them off to different locations within South Florida.
The son said he had been visited by 2 of his father's friends who were on board the ship the night his father drowned. They told him that the boat was raided by a group of gunmen dressed as cops.
So that's where your father was going that night.
The raiders threw the 6-man crew overboard and then stole about 450 kilos of cocaine.
Each kilo at that time was worth approximately $60,000. So the net retail value of this load was approximately $27 million. Now that's not the street value. The street value is probably 2-3 times that.
The son provided the names of all 3 men who survived, but said he didn't know how to contact them. The Centac detectives needed to find out if there had been a legitimate raid at the marina. They contacted every law enforcement agency in South Florida that handled drug cases.
None of them had any operations close to the boatyard where this incident happened. So at that time, when I canceled out that this was a legitimate raid, my next focus was, well, these people must have been phony cops, people impersonating police officers, because there was a trend at that time for people to dress up as police officers and raid drug dealers' homes and steal their cash and steal their drugs.
To check the victim's son's story, investigators went to the marina where the raid took place. They interviewed the security guard who had been on duty that night.
How are you?
He said that 7 or 8 men in police uniforms rushed the marina and headed for one of the boats.
They went right past the security guard. The security guard said, being South Florida, there's nothing unusual, you know, go at it.
He hadn't gotten a good look at any of them. Investigators later searched that boat but found no clues. So they turned their attention to looking for the 3 men who had survived the raid. 2 of the 3 survivors had minor police records but could not be located at their last known address. next day, Syntac 26 detectives played a hunch. They figured that the survivors would likely be going to the wake for one of the deceased victims.
So we showed up at the funeral home with the names and identities of the people who we were looking for.
The detectives were right. They recognized the survivors from arrest photos and approached the men as they entered. The men confirmed the boat was overrun by a group of raiders dressed like cops.
They're wearing blue uniforms. They had their
But the men denied the boat was involved in drug running. They claimed they were simply having a party.
They had been drinking beer with the 3 victims and 2 additional friends, and while they were there drinking beer and having a good time, people in blue uniforms stormed past the front gate of the marina and started yelling, "Police, police."
The gunmen began assaulting them.
They said several friends were thrown in the water by these individuals dressed in blue uniforms.
Within minutes, all 6 men were overboard in the Miami River. But only 3 swam to safety. The investigation had now become a triple homicide. The Syntac 26 detectives were convinced the raid was yet another instance of fake cops ripping off drug dealers.
15-20 minutes.
But again, the survivors denied that drugs were on the boat and insisted they did not know why the men attacked them. They said they didn't see any badge numbers or police cars, couldn't even tell which department the uniforms were from. With no detailed information from the 2 witnesses, the investigators were left without any significant leads. With the case stalled, the FBI offered their assistance. Special Agent Robert Martin.
At about the same time that the homicide investigation began regarding the 3 bodies found in the Miami River, an FBI cooperating witness provided some information to us regarding a group of police officers who were involved in some rip-offs. And he identified who those guys were, at least several of them, knew who some of them were, had conversations with them.
Detective Alvarez got an unexpected call from an agent in counterintelligence.
He says he needs to meet with us, that he has motive and possible information about our case. He put 2 and 2 together, so maybe this is related to this information that I'm getting through my informant, Armando Un.
Now we can narrow down.
Armando Un, the FBI agent said, was a well-connected nightclub worker that knew about a group of crooked cops who were ripping off drug dealers along the Miami River. Syntac 26 detectives went to see Armando Un. But he did not want to see them. The interview went nowhere. It would take the murder of a friend before Armando Un would talk. A motorist was driving through the Everglades. He spotted something that piqued his curiosity, a wooden box. He pulled over. To his horror, he found a body inside. He called police. Detectives from Miami-Dade's Drug Task Force, Syntac 26, were investigating the deaths of 3 men found floating in the Miami River. They hoped an informant named Armando Un could help them. His friend and employer had been found murdered in the Florida Everglades. His name was Luis Rodriguez, the owner of a nightclub in Miami's Little Havana district. He'd been shot several times in the head and then stuffed in a box rigged to spring open. A gruesome display. Investigating for Syntac 26 was Detective Alex Alvarez and Sergeant George Plasencia. They needed to get Armando Un to talk.
We never mentioned anything about the 3 bodies Our ploy in speaking to him was that we were investigating the death of his best friend, the murder of his best friend.
According to Detective Plasencia, Armando Un was very candid.
We sat down and chatted with him for a while about Luis Rodriguez, and he said, yeah, Luis Rodriguez was involved in drug trafficking.
Would you recognize him? Do you know what
He admitted that Rodriguez was dealing drugs out of his nightclub and said he believed the men Rodriguez was involved with killed him.
It is true that he was trafficking drugs.
He was furious that his friend had been murdered and said he wanted to help.
He was making money for everybody. He would
But
give
if
some
he knew about police officers, real or fake, robbing drug dealers, he said nothing.
He never mentioned that the police officers were involved. He did say that Luis Rodriguez was friendly with some officers.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Armando Un seemed wary and selected his words carefully. When the interview ended, the detectives still had no suspects in the Miami River murders. All they really knew was that Luis Rodriguez was dead and may be the 4th drug murder victim in as many days. Then a City of Miami detective contacted Plasencia and Alvarez with a surprising lead. He said that Luis Rodriguez had also worked for him as a police informant.
He told us that Luis Rodriguez was giving him information about people who were dressed as police imposters and were ripping off drug dealers and committing murders in Dade County.
The detective explained that he had met Luis Rodriguez through a Miami patrol officer named Marco Rivera.
I said, we need your help now. I need you to set up a meeting between the street cop and George and I, and let's tell him that we're investigating Luis Rodriguez's murder. That'll be the cover story.
The meeting was set for that night at the Miami Police Department. Officer Rivera worked the late shift in 60 Sector, police code for Little Havana. He verified that he knew Luis Rodriguez and that Rodriguez had, on occasion, been his informant. But then, without prompting, he brought up the Miami River drownings.
He volunteered some information about the 3 bodies that were floating up in the Miami River. He said that these guys stole the drugs themselves, and when the owner of the drugs found out about it, had them murdered, or they were thrown in the water and drowned themselves, that there was no cops involved at all.
His denial that officers were involved, which no one had mentioned, seemed too forceful. The Centac 26 detectives tested him.
We asked this patrolman to repeat his story at the conclusion of our meeting, and we detected that this story didn't fit the first story that he had told us. There was something wrong there.
Rivera claimed a street source told him about the raid, so the detectives asked to speak directly with the source.
Yeah, I guess so. You know, just give me a call tomorrow. I'll try to contact him, and if I can't get in contact with him for any reason, I'll let you guys know.
For the Centac investigators, the case had taken a dramatic turn. This officer, sworn to uphold the law, seemed to be hiding something. The following day, Officer Marco Rivera introduced the detectives to the source who allegedly had information about the Miami River murders.
I don't know if I should even be talking to these guys. I don't even know, bro.
Rivera claimed his source could verify that drug trafficking Colombians had carried out the raid, not Miami cops.
Hey, listen on, man. Hey, listen, we understand that.
But as the source spoke, he had a hard time remembering details of his story. Officer Rivera had to help him remember, according to Detective Alvarez.
The officer keeps having to correct him. No, it happened like this, and tell him about this, and he's filling in the blanks for this guy who's obviously been coached and cued on what to say. So we knew at that point, obviously, he was covering something up.
Officer Rivera's cover-up meant the detectives were faced with an even more serious problem. In case the deadly raiders were actually Miami police officers, they needed to be very careful.
This is a problem that we weren't really trained or focused in to investigate, which is, we're not internal affairs investigators. We don't investigate cops. That wasn't our role. That wasn't our job. But we were charged with the responsibilities of investigating these murders, and if these murders were committed by cops, they were fair play. We realized that if we were going to start to investigate cops, we'd have to do things very differently.
The Syntac 26 detectives had to cover themselves. They asked the police chief to hold their personnel files as a precaution against internal leaks.
We did a lot of things to protect our identity and our family's identity. We took everything that we had in our names and took them out of our names so they couldn't trace where we lived and who we were. We're investigating. They're going to find out who we are. So right away, we built a wall between them and us.
Once they felt safe, Syntac detectives began investigating the officers working the night shift in 60 Sector, Little Havana, Officer Marco Rivera's beat.
Sounds good. Okay.
With the chief's permission, Miami PD's Internal Affairs gave Syntac 26 the personnel records for the officers in question.
Well, the City of Miami Internal Affairs Unit was very concerned. They were very cooperative. The names that we provided to them, they started looking into and giving us the backgrounds that they had on these individuals.
The investigators focused on a close-knit group of 8 officers, all relatively recent hires who joined the force at a time when Miami was in crisis. In the spring of 1980, Cuban President Fidel Castro had announced he would allow thousands of political refugees to seek asylum in foreign countries. The U.S. agreed to accept 3,500. Then, unexpectedly, Castro announced that for the first time in years, he would also allow American boats to enter Mariel Harbor. The result was what became known as the Mariel Boat Lift. More than 120,000 Cuban refugees flooded into South Florida, which overwhelmed Miami's ability to handle them. Most were hard-working immigrants looking for a chance at the American dream. Most, but not all.
10% of them was estimated were criminals that were dumped out of the prison system of Fidel Castro. So there was a spike in the crime wave in Miami-Dade County.
To stem the rising crime rate, the city had to hire over 400 new cadets in 3 years.
Instead of hiring the best candidate, they hired anybody who was just marginally acceptable. They just couldn't find enough quality candidates, and they went for quantity as opposed to quality.
Syntac 26 began surveillance, watching as the officers in question hung out together after hours, enjoying lifestyles far beyond the means of honest police officers. Marco Rivera was the suspected ringleader. Armando Garcia had recently become part owner of a bodybuilding gym. Osvaldo Coelho had just retired from the force. He was 30 years old, driving a $100,000 Lotus. It was easy to track their lavish spending.
One officer bought a home and built this pool, and he paid the developer cash. Showed up with a bag full of cash and gave it to him here for the purchase of my home.
Still, the detectives had little solid evidence.
Yeah, I'm in front of the restaurant. I don't see any marked units over here. Our boy is definitely over here having coffee with some friends outside, but I don't see any units.
They needed first-hand information, and they needed it soon. If these officers had already left at least 3 people dead, the detectives feared there could easily be more. 4 people had been murdered in Miami over a $27 million drug deal, gone bad. With so much money involved, The dividing line between the criminals and the cops blurred. The FBI offered their assistance to local law enforcement. Special Agent Robert Martin.
We began an investigation which became a joint investigation into whether there was some police corruption in the city of Miami.
Drug Task Force detectives with Centac 26 had narrowed their investigation to a suspected group of corrupt Miami police officers. But the detectives needed inside information if they had any chance of cracking the case. They hoped they could get it from a reluctant police informer named Armando Un. They had already interviewed Un about the murder of his friend and partner, nightclub owner Luis Rodriguez. He seemed wary, perhaps afraid they too were dirty cops.
Hey, Armando, I want you to look at these photographs, see if you recognize anyone.
Detective George Placencia tried to win his trust by showing photos of their surveillance of the suspect officers.
And he started looking through the photos and he just paused. He dropped the photographs and shook her hand and he says, "You guys are doing a good job. Let's sit down and talk."
But unfortunately, these things go wrong.
Un came down to Centac 26, where he told Detective Alex Alvarez he figured he had nothing to lose.
He was scared. He thought, well, if I stick it out with the crooked cops, they were the ones that probably killed my partner. And he said, well, if they killed him, the next person to go is me.
In a marathon debriefing, he explained the origins of the rogue officers and their criminal enterprise. He said his friend and employer, nightclub owner Luis Rodriguez, had grown tired of the officers coming into his bar and shaking down his patrons for small amounts of drugs.
He wanted to make sure that his customers weren't bothered. So he first started paying the cops off not to come.
And you can maybe get a couple of gram arrests. But
soon he devised another plan that could make everyone some money.
You know, sometimes these things happen. It's just the nature of the business.
According to Un, Luis Rodriguez said to the officers, "Hey, you know what? Instead of arresting these people that are coming over here with petty drugs, why don't I set up deals, you know, maybe multi-kilo deals, more drugs involved, and when these people come over, I'll give you a description of their car, where they're coming from. You can stop them, steal their cocaine, bring it to me, I'll sell it, I'll give you a share."
The officers agreed.
What made this whole thing possible for these cops was they grew up and knew people who were in the drug trade. And that was the one aspect of what they had going for them.
Patrolman Marco Rivera ran the ripoffs. It seemed a perfect plan. The dealers would never incriminate themselves by reporting the thefts, and Rodriguez would always come through with the cash.
Get in your car. You have a good night now.
Un said the operation grew quickly, with more and more cops becoming involved. But they got greedy, wanting to do more rip-offs and bigger ones.
So the policeman said, okay, it was all good. And it all first began with...
Rodriguez introduced them to a second bar owner who knew of larger shipments.
Luis Rodriguez brought in another bar owner. He knew and he worked smuggling boatloads of drugs into the United States. And Rodriguez says, wait a minute, why stop at these 1 kilo, 2 kilograms of cocaine drug bust? Why don't we go for the boatloads and get 300, 400, 500 kilograms of cocaine at one shot?
Un didn't know about the raid where the 3 men drowned, but he did describe an earlier one the second bar owner had set up. A group of Miami officers had slipped aboard a boat at another marina, thinking the crew had left for the night.
Clear.
They knew exactly where the drugs were hidden. But during the unloading, they noticed the air conditioning was on. And suspected the crew was still on board, hiding.
Oye, nadie está muerto, alguien está aquí. Alguien está aquí, oye. Chequea ahí abajo. Espérate.
The crewmen surrendered.
Póngalo, abajo. Sí, abajo. Vámonos. Vamos. Uno por uno.
The raiders wasted no time disposing of the crew, as they had in the other raid. This time, no one drowned. All the men swam safely to shore. The cops finished up, then drove off with about 200 kilos of cocaine, valued at over $10 million. Armando Un confirmed the names of the officers involved, the very ones Sentak had been watching. Unfortunately, the investigators knew his credibility would be attacked in court.
Jury's not going to believe Armando Un, a self-proclaimed admitted drug trafficker, over, half a dozen or a dozen respected police officers. They're just not going to believe it. So we need more evidence.
What they needed was a confession on tape from the very cops they were investigating. They brought in the local bar owner from the drug raids and explained the evidence they had implicating him in the rip-offs. He reluctantly agreed to wear a wire and to meet with Officer Marco Rivera. But he said Rivera had been avoiding him for weeks, no doubt because of the Sentak 26 investigation. They would have to trick him into the meeting. Investigators hoped the results would be worth the risk. Detectives set up in a building across from a bar in the area Rivera patrolled and sent the informant inside. When surveillance units confirmed Rivera was nearby, detectives called 911 and reported a bar fight.
Some officers down to 34th and 8th.
Officer Rivera drove up just as they planned. Rivera entered, looking for the alleged fight, but everything was quiet. The informant made his move. He told the officer he'd been subpoenaed by the U.S. Attorney's Office and wanted to know what to say. Rivera took the bait, but he didn't want to talk in front of witnesses. The corrupt cop spoke freely about his involvement in the drug operation.
So what's the real deal? Why are you worried?
So I can't Joey Samuel, yeah, he's dead. He ain't gonna talk. Unless they go in that courtroom with a Ouija board and no one say nothing, okay?
Rivera had no idea everything he said was being recorded. In Miami, investigators pursued a group of rogue police officers suspected of ripping off drug dealers and killing at least 3 of them. The detectives of Sentak 26 finally managed to tape an incriminating conversation with the group's leader, Officer Rivera, as he talked about the raids, the drugs, the dirty cops. Detective Alex Alvarez.
It was key evidence, because it was the corrupt police officer's own words about what he did, when he did it, and who he did it with.
The U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami reviewed the tapes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Russell Killinger knew they would need as much evidence as possible to convince a jury that several Miami law enforcement officers were behind the murders and thefts. The tapes provided a good start, but Killinger needed more evidence to implicate the other officers. Perhaps Armando Un could get it.
We wanted to get Un wearing a wire and talking to the other cops so that we get those other cops to confirm their own participation out of their own mouths.
Wearing a wire, Un met with Miami officers Marco Rivera and Armando Garcia. He told them that investigators were asking him questions about the boat raids. They warned him not to cooperate. He assured him Syntac had nothing on any of them.
Listen, they all over me. They all over me. They all over everybody. It doesn't matter. They got nothing. They don't have a damn thing. I don't want you guys to be seen.
But then they became suspicious, asking him if he was wired. That effectively halted all plans to record any more of the officers. But investigators were undaunted.
We decided to take more of an overt approach in the investigation and go to the next level, which was basically subpoenaing witnesses to the grand juries, issuing bank subpoenas for bank records and financial records.
Investigators began cataloging the assets of the suspects, including Marco Rivera's safety deposit box at a Miami bank. The box contained over $260,000 in cash, nearly 10 times his annual salary. Like Rivera, the other suspect officers left incriminating money trails.
The money was burning holes in their pockets, and they were going out and spending money left and right. They buy $20, $30, $40, $50,000 cars, cash. They bought homes valued in excess of $200,000, cash. They bought expensive furniture. They put down cash. Now, this is an officer who's making $30,000. We had an enormous amount of evidence.
The financial records, together with the taped conversations, were enough evidence for arrest warrants to be issued.
Suspecting you guys.
2 days after Christmas 1985, Syntac 26, Miami PD, and the FBI began the arrests, taking down 6 Miami cops, including the ringleader, Officer Marco Rivera. Officer Armando Garcia was also arrested without incident. Osvaldo Coelho and Emilio Rey surrendered in the following days. The trial began on September 29, 1986. Federal prosecutors thought they had a strong case.
We felt pretty good about the case. We'd gotten pretty much all the evidence in that we had hoped to get in.
Then, on January 21st, 1987, the jury came back with their verdicts.
I remember the judge just kept looking at the verdict forms, and he would look at one and put it down, and look at another and put it down, then pick up the other one and look at it again, and this went on for, it seemed like an eternity. And then he started shaking his head.
The jury was deadlocked, causing the judge to declare a mistrial. One juror had refused to deliberate. Investigators were stunned as all suspects were released.
That was really a low point in the investigation. We found out later, because the 11 jurors that voted for conviction were so convinced that these officers, because of all the evidence, were guilty, they started coming forward and saying, you know, we started getting contacted by friends and family members of these cops offering us jobs and offering us money, and we knew that that was an attempt to try to get us to sway our votes.
The mistrial was an enormous setback. Detectives knew if they could not put these corrupt cops away, the people of Miami may never trust law enforcement again. A group of Miami officers were arrested and prosecuted for corruption, but chaos in the jury room resulted in a mistrial. All suspects were released.
They were thrilled that they weren't convicted. What they didn't realize that it was probably a blessing in disguise for us, because all that did is give us more time, and we were more determined to find out more evidence against them, and that's exactly what happened.
The prosecutor and detectives were unwilling to give up. With so much at stake, investigators needed a break. They finally got one.
We found out that these officers had hired a hitman to kill Armando Un.
That hitman was Killer Joe Martinez. He confessed to being hired, hoping he'd get leniency for another crime he had committed.
We brought him in. He testified against the river cops. We were able to add more charges against them. And by that time, you know, the case was just becoming stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and they had nowhere to go, and then they started to fold and they started to cooperate.
The case finally broke wide open when one of the defendants, Patrolman Emilio Rey, decided to confess. Through his lawyer, he had learned of the additional evidence against him. He hoped for sentencing leniency in exchange for his testimony.
He described to us some fairly bone-chilling conspiracies that had gone on and that were going on in an effort to try to kill the government witnesses.
All of the government's witnesses, especially Armando Un, were in danger. Investigators knew they had to use Patrolman Rey's confession to put more pressure on the other river cops. Facing the beefed-up federal case, ringleader Marco Rivera confessed.
He had implicated some 60 other City Miami police officers in various criminal activities.
Unfortunately, Osvaldo Coelho and Armando Garcia fled the Miami area. 5 months later, an FBI informant said Coelho was hiding in the Bahamas. The FBI has no formal jurisdiction outside the United States, so it maintains legal attaché offices called legats in many foreign countries. They work as liaisons with each country's national police. The FBI liaison asked the Bahamian police for their assistance. They agreed to help get Coelho. Coelho was wanted for taking part in massive and deadly cocaine rip-offs in Miami. Investigators knew he had a broad network of friends he could ask for help. Coelho called one of them several times to arrange for assistance.
Yeah, I can help you. What do you need?
Okay, I can do that. Good. See you then.
What Coelho didn't know was that the FBI had already approached the friend, and he was working as an informant. The Bahamian police arrested Osvaldo Coelho without incident. He was extradited back to Miami to face charges of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and racketeering. Armando Garcia was the last of the rogue Miami cops still at large. On January 8, 1989, the FBI added Garcia to their 10 most wanted fugitives list. FBI Special Agent Robert Martin.
We don't pick our top 10 fugitives lightly. They have to be people that we consider to be a serious danger, not only to society, but to the very nature and fabric of what makes our country what it is. And one of those things is honest law enforcement services. Garcia was added to the list for that reason.
The FBI had evidence that Garcia may have fled to South America, but had few leads. Special Agent Robert Martin ran the public corruption squad that kept searching for the elusive fugitive.
Armando Garcia was uniquely qualified to understand what it was going to take to survive out of the country. Here was a police officer who knew every technique that we might use to find him or capture him. A guy that knew the difficulties moving in and out of foreign countries and doing investigations in those foreign countries. On top of that, you had a guy that had a lot of money. Hey, I was just looking at these passports.
Garcia could be anywhere. For 4 years, agents looked into hundreds of leads with negative results.
I don't know, I'll ask him. Ian, do you have...
Then, in late 1993, the FBI got a tip. A friend was planning to visit the Garcia family in Colombia.
Okay, she didn't have it. I tell you, if you just make that call.
Agents worked with the Colombian police, who followed the friend to an apartment in Cali. Agents believed that fugitive Armando Garcia was living there.
The Colombian National Police set up a surveillance with a number of units. It was going to be a 24-hour surveillance, and waited to see if they could identify anybody who had come out or traveled around with her.
Three days later, they spotted Armando Garcia. The fugitive was caught off guard, unarmed.
Hold it, Garcia.
Garcia told them, said, I have $4,000 with me. You see the jewelry I have, you see my automobile, I have goods and belongings in my apartment. You can have all of that if you just let me go. And to quote the Colombian National Police official who came to Miami to describe events, they then told Armando Garcia, we're not the dirty cops, you are.
The last of the main suspects, Armando Garcia pleaded guilty to drug trafficking, racketeering, and tax evasion, and was sentenced to 25 years. When it was all over, 17 Miami officers were convicted for their involvement in the drug rip-off ring. It was the largest police corruption case in Florida history. In response to the scandal, the City of Miami Police Department formed its own internal investigations unit that targeted over 100 additional officers.
They obviously were suffering from all the media exposure and then the embarrassment of having numerous officers arrested, but I think it made them a stronger department. When you weed out the bad officers, it just makes the good officers shine even brighter.